Marry me. The words hit me like a freight train as I stared at my best friend Jake across our tiny Brooklyn apartment. My coffee mug slipped from my trembling hands, crashing onto the hardwood floor in a symphony of broken ceramic. "What did you just say?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. Jake's green eyes were desperate, wild with panic, his usually perfect blonde hair messy from running his hands through it obsessively. The Jake I knew was always composed, always had everything figured out. This Jake looked like he was drowning. "Listen, Carter, I know this sounds completely insane, but I'm getting deported next month. My student visa expires in 32 days, and without a green card," his voice cracked like thin ice under pressure, "I'll lose everything. My job at Morrison & Associates, my future, my entire life here, everything we've built." The air seemed to leave the room entirely. 3 years of friendship, 3 years of me pretending I wasn't completely hopelessly in love with him. And now this nuclear bomb of a request. My knees felt weak as I processed his words. "You want me to fake marry you?" I said slowly, the words tasting bitter and impossible on my tongue. My hands shook as I knelt to pick up the broken pieces of my favorite mug, the one Jake had bought me last Christmas with a stupid joke about coffee addicts printed on it. He dropped to his knees beside me without hesitation, his fingers accidentally brushing mine as we both reached for the same shard. The contact sent electricity shooting through my skin, the same electric shock I'd felt every time we'd accidentally touched over the past 3 years. "I know it's not fair to ask this of you," he whispered, his voice so soft I had to lean closer to hear him. "But Carter, you're the only person in this world I trust completely. The only one who knows me well enough to pull this off convincingly." I looked into his eyes and saw something I'd never seen before in all our years of friendship. Raw, unfiltered vulnerability. Jake had always been the strong one, the one who had his life mapped out perfectly. Seeing him like this, desperate and scared, made my chest ache in ways I couldn't name. "What happens when they interview us?" I asked, trying to inject some rationality into this insane conversation. "Immigration officers aren't stupid, Jake. They've seen every trick in the book. They'll know we're lying. Then we'll have to make them believe we're really in love." His thumb traced across my knuckles as we both held pieces of broken ceramic, and I wondered desperately if he could feel how my pulse raced at even this simple touch. "We know each other better than most real couples do. We finish each other's sentences. We know each other's habits. We've been practically living in each other's pockets for 3 years. How hard can it be to pretend we're romantically involved? If only he knew I wouldn't be pretending at all. If only he knew that every casual touch, every lingering glance, every moment we spent together had been slowly killing me because I wanted it to mean something it never could. If only he knew that the hardest part wouldn't be convincing immigration officers we were in love. It would be convincing myself that none of it was real when every fiber of my being wished it was. "Jake," I started, then stopped. How could I explain that this would be torture for me? How could I tell him that I'd been dreaming about being his boyfriend, his husband, his everything since the day we met in that crowded college lecture hall? How could I admit that I'd spent countless nights lying awake in my bed, wondering what it would feel like to wake up next to him every morning? "Please, Carter." The desperation in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. Jake Morrison didn't beg. He was confident, successful, the golden boy who'd graduated summa cum laude and landed his dream job before most people our age had even figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. But here he was on his knees on my apartment floor, begging me to save his future. "I'll do anything to make this work. I'll be the perfect fake husband. I'll learn everything about you, memorize every detail of our fake relationship. Practice until it's perfect." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was the man I'd been madly in love with for 3 years, offering to be my husband, and it was all a lie. A beautiful, necessary, heartbreaking lie. "What about after?" I asked quietly. "What happens when you get your green card, when you don't need a fake husband anymore?" Something flickered across his face, an expression too quick for me to catch and interpret. "We'll figure that out when we get there," he said. "Right now I just need to know if you'll do this. If you'll take this crazy leap with me." I looked at him kneeling there among the broken pieces of my coffee mug, and I realized that this moment was going to change everything between us. One way or another, either I'd say no and watch him get deported, losing him forever, or I'd say yes and spend however many months living the most beautiful lie of my life, pretending to be loved by the one person I'd never been able to get over. Okay, I heard myself say, the word falling from my lips before my rational mind could stop it. I'll do it. I'll marry you. The relief that flooded his face was so intense it almost took my breath away. He surged forward and wrapped me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. And for just a moment I let myself imagine this was real. That he was holding me because he loved me, not because I'd just agreed to commit immigration fraud for him. Thank you, he breathed against my hair, and I felt something warm and wet against my scalp. Was he crying? Carter, I swear I'll make this up to you somehow. I'll be the best fake husband you could ask for. As I held him there on my apartment floor, surrounded by broken ceramic and the shattered remains of my simple, uncomplicated life, I realized that tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow we'd start living like a couple, sleeping in the same bed, learning each other's routines, building a love story convincing enough to fool the government. Tomorrow I'd begin the most beautiful torture of my life, being married to Jake Morrison while pretending my feelings weren't real. But tonight, I could just hold him and pretend that when he said I'll be the best husband, he meant it in every way that mattered. 2 weeks later, we stood outside City Hall on a crisp October morning, my hands trembling as I held a cheap engagement ring we'd bought at a pawn shop in Queens. Jake wore the blue button-down shirt I'd always told him brought out his eyes. Ironic that on our fake wedding day he looked more perfect than I'd ever seen him. The past 14 days had been a crash course in couple behavior. We'd moved Jake's belongings into my studio apartments, creating the illusion of domestic bliss while I died a little inside every time he casually walked around in just his boxers or fell asleep with his arm draped across my chest. We'd practiced our story until we could recite it in our sleep, how we'd fallen in love gradually, how I'd proposed during a quiet dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, how we couldn't wait to spend the rest of our lives together. Every lie came so easily because underneath each fabrication was a kernel of desperate truth. Ready? Jake asked, sliding his hand into mine as we approached the courthouse steps. His palm was warm and slightly damp with nervous sweat, and the gesture felt so natural I almost forgot this was all performance. Carter, if you want to back out, if this is too much. No, I said quickly, maybe too quickly. My voice cracked slightly as I squeezed his fingers. I'm ready. We need to do this. The truth was that I wanted to do this, even if it was fake. Even if it meant nothing to him, it meant everything to me. The ceremony was brief and impersonal. Just us, two strangers serving as witnesses, and a bored-looking clerk who'd probably performed hundreds of these quickie marriages. But when Jake said I do and slid the simple gold band onto my finger, my heart hammered as if this was the real thing. His hands were gentle, steady, and his eyes locked with mine in a way that made my breath catch. You may kiss your husband, the clerk announced in a monotone voice that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Our first kiss. Our fake first kiss. Jake's face leaned toward mine, his breath warm against my lips, smelling like the mint gum he always chewed when he was nervous. This is just for show, he whispered so quietly only I could hear. But when his lips touched mine, something fundamental shifted in the universe. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deeper as some invisible barrier between us dissolved. For 10 incredible seconds I forgot this was pretend. His lips were warm and perfect, moving against mine with a gentleness that made my knees weak. When his tongue briefly touched my lower lip, a small sound escaped from somewhere deep in my chest, half sigh, half moan, and I felt him tense against me. When we finally broke apart, Jake's eyes held something I couldn't read. Confusion? Surprise? Or was I just projecting my own desperate hope onto his expression? His cheeks were flushed, and he looked as breathless as I felt. Congratulations, the clerk said, stamping our marriage certificate with official finality. You're now legally married. Legally married. Fake but legal. The irony burned in my chest as Jake's thumb absently stroked across my knuckles while we signed the paperwork. Every casual touch felt like electricity, and I wondered how I was going to survive months of this beautiful torture. Walking out of City Hall as Jake's husband felt surreal. The afternoon sun seemed brighter. The city sounds sharper, everything heightened because of the ring on my finger. And the man beside me who now legally belonged to me, even if he didn't actually want to. So husband, Jake said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, what do married couples do on their wedding day? The question hit me harder than it should have. Real couples would go home and make love, would celebrate their new life together, would talk about their future and their dreams. Instead, we were going home to practice more lies and prepare for tomorrow's immigration interview, the real test that would determine if our performance was convincing enough to save Jake's future. We prepare, I said, trying to inject some lightness into my voice. Tomorrow we have to convince Officer Martinez that we're madly in love. That night, lying in bed next to Jake, our bed, I had to remind myself, not just mine anymore. I stared at the ceiling and listened to his breathing gradually slow into sleep. He'd changed into an old t-shirt and boxers, the same thing he'd been wearing to sleep for the past 2 weeks. But now there was something different about sharing this space. Now I was his husband, even if only on paper. Carter? His voice was soft in the darkness, and I thought he'd fallen asleep. Yeah? Thank you for all of this. I know it's not easy. If only he knew how not easy it was. If only he knew that every moment of this fake marriage was simultaneously the best and worst thing that had ever happened to me. It's okay, I whispered back. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's the real test. But I lay awake long after his breathing evened out, studying his profile in the dim light from the street lamp outside our window. Tomorrow we'd have to convince a trained professional that our love was real. The terrifying part wasn't that we might fail, it was that for me, none of it would be acting at all. The next morning, we sat in the sterile waiting room of the Federal Immigration Building, my leg bouncing nervously while Jake flipped through our carefully prepared evidence folder for the 100th time. Inside were dozens of photos we'd staged over the past 2 weeks. Us cooking dinner together, cuddling on the couch during movie night, even one of us kissing in Central Park that had required 17 takes because I kept freezing up whenever his lips got close to mine. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison? A stern-looking Latina woman in a crisp business suit appeared in the doorway. Officer Martinez looked like she'd been conducting these interviews for decades and had seen every type of immigration fraud imaginable. Her dark eyes swept over us with the precision of a hawk studying prey. Actually, it's Mr. Morrison and Mr. Carter Morrison, Jake corrected politely, standing up and extending his hand. I kept my name professionally, but legally I'm Carter Morrison now. We'd practiced this detail. Jake's law firm knew him as Jake Morrison, so it made sense he'd keep his name professionally while taking mine legally. It was a small touch, but one that showed we'd thought through the practical aspects of our supposed marriage. Follow me, Officer Martinez said curtly, leading us down a hallway lined with identical doors. The building felt designed to intimidate, harsh fluorescent lighting, beige walls, the constant hum of bureaucracy grinding away at human dreams and desperation. The interview room was small and windowless, with a metal table, 3 uncomfortable chairs, and a recording device that Officer Martinez clicked on with ominous finality. This interview is being recorded, she announced. Any false statements can be used against you in deportation proceedings and criminal prosecution. My mouth went dry. Criminal prosecution. We weren't just risking Jake's deportation anymore. We were risking jail time. Tell me about your husband's morning routine, Officer Martinez began, her pen poised over a legal pad like a weapon. I took a breath, trying to channel the calmness Jake always exhibited under pressure. He always makes coffee first, I said, grateful that my voice sounded steadier than I felt. 2 sugars, no cream. He's very particular about it. Has to be that expensive Colombian blend from the coffee shop on 5th Street. Then he goes for his morning run while I shower and get ready for work. All of it was true. Living with Jake for 2 weeks had given me intimate knowledge of his routines, his habits, the way he hummed while he brushed his teeth, and how he always double-checked that the door was locked exactly 3 times before going to bed. And how long have you been romantically involved? 8 months, Jake answered before I could speak. We'd rehearsed this. Met as friends in college, stayed close for 3 years, romance blossomed 8 months ago. Simple, believable timeline. Officer Martinez made notes, her expression unreadable. Mr. Carter Morrison, when did you realize you were in love with your husband? My throat tightened. This was the question I'd been dreading because the real answer was the first day I met him, but our story required something more recent, more believable. It was gradual, I said carefully. We'd been best friends for so long that I didn't realize my feelings had changed until I couldn't imagine my life without him anymore. It just sort of hit me one day that friendship had turned into something deeper. Interesting. She made another note, and something in her tone made my stomach clench. Mr. Morrison, you told my colleague yesterday that you fell in love during a thunderstorm. A specific evening you described in great detail. Can you explain this discrepancy? The blood drained from my face. Thunderstorm. We hadn't prepared any story about a thunderstorm. Jake had improvised during his separate interview, and now our carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in real time. One wrong answer and months of preparation would be destroyed. The thunderstorm, I repeated, stalling for time while my mind raced. Jake's eyes met mine across the table, and I could see the panic he was trying to hide. That was when everything crystallized, when gradual feelings became impossible to ignore. Explain, Officer Martinez demanded, leaning back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just caught their prey in a trap. It was last April, I said slowly, praying Jake would follow my lead. We were watching a movie at my apartment when this massive storm hit. The power went out and Jake lit candles while we waited for it to come back on. Jake's eyes widened slightly and I could see recognition dawning. There had been a storm in April. I remembered it vividly because we'd spent the evening together, talking by candlelight until 3 in the morning. It was one of those nights when our friendship had felt charged with something neither of us acknowledged. In the candlelight, Jake picked up the story, his voice gaining confidence. Everything looked different. Carter looked different. I realized I'd been seeing him as just my friend. But that night, he paused, looking at me with an expression that seemed almost genuine. That night I saw him as the person I wanted to spend my life with. What happened next? Officer Martinez pressed, clearly testing whether our stories would align. My heart pounded as I tried to remember that actual night, not create a fictional one. We talked until the power came back on. I said truthfully. About everything and nothing. Our dreams, our fears, what we wanted from life. It was one of those conversations that changes you, you know? And then, Jake reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb brushing across my knuckles. Then I finally found the courage to tell him how I felt, he said softly. And miracle of miracles, he felt the same way. Officer Martinez studied us for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving between our faces, analyzing our body language, searching for tells that would give away the lie. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Finally she spoke. I'm going to separate you for individual questioning. If this marriage is legitimate, your stories will match perfectly. If not, she let the threat hang in the air like a sword about to fall. As they led Jake away to another room, he squeezed my hand one last time. In that touch I felt something that went beyond our practiced performance, something that made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, some part of our fake love story was becoming real. But sitting alone in that interrogation room, waiting for questions that could destroy both our futures, I realized that wondering wasn't enough. Tomorrow, Jake might be free to stay in the country, free to live his life, free to find someone he actually loved, and I'd still be the best friend who'd helped him fake his way to a green card, watching from the sidelines as he built a real life with someone else. The door opened and Officer Martinez returned with a stack of papers and an expression I couldn't read. Final test, she announced. I want you to write down, in detail, the exact moment you knew you were in love. Every specific detail of that thunderstorm night. If you're really married, if you really love each other, your accounts will be identical. As she placed a blank sheet of paper in front of me, I realized that our entire future now depended on my ability to remember one perfect April night when Jake and I had talked by candlelight, unaware that those stolen hours of intimacy would someday either save us or destroy us completely. Sit down, both of you. Officer Martinez's tone had shifted from professional to downright menacing. Jake settled into the chair beside me and I could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat from a furnace. His knee bounced nervously under the table, a tell I'd learned to recognize over 3 years of friendship. Your stories don't match. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter, threatening to make me physically sick. This was the moment I'd been dreading since we'd walked into this sterile government building, caught red-handed in our lies, facing deportation for Jake and federal charges for me. The recording device on the table seemed to mock us with its steady red light, capturing every word that might be used to destroy our futures. The thunderstorm incident. Officer Martinez continued, studying our faces with the intensity of a predator sizing up wounded prey. Her dark eyes moved between us, cataloging every micro-expression, every nervous twitch, every bead of sweat. Miss Carter, you're claiming this was a gradual realization of love. Mr. Morrison, you've described a specific night with a storm and power outage. Care to explain this rather significant discrepancy? Jake's eyes met mine across the table, and I saw raw panic there, barely contained behind his usually composed facade. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle ticking in his cheek. I could practically hear his thoughts racing, trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster, how to fix what seemed unfixable. Officer Martinez, I said slowly, making a split-second decision that could either save us or damn us completely. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, though my hands were trembling beneath the table. Both stories are true. It was a gradual process. But that particular night, I paused, looking directly into Jake's green eyes, hoping he could read the message I was trying to send. That night, everything became crystal clear. Explain, she demanded, leaning back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed they were about to watch us hang ourselves with our own contradictions. It was last April, I continued, praying to whatever deity might be listening that Jake would follow my lead and not contradict whatever I was about to say. We were watching a movie at my apartment when this massive thunderstorm hit. The power went out and Jake lit candles while we waited for it to come back on. Jake's eyes widened slightly and I could see recognition dawning in them. He remembered that night. How could he not? It had been one of those perfect, intimate evenings that had tortured me for months afterward, when I'd replayed every word, every glance, every moment of closeness that had felt charged with unspoken possibility. In that flickering candlelight, Jake picked up the story, his voice gaining strength and conviction with each word. Everything shifted. Carter looked different somehow. I'd been fighting these feelings for months, telling myself it was just friendship, but that night, he paused, and when he looked at me, there was something in his eyes that made my breath catch. That night, I realized Carter wasn't just my friend. He was everything. Officer Martinez observed us with the patience of a seasoned interrogator, her pen poised over her legal pad like a weapon ready to strike. The silence stretched between us, thick with tension and unspoken truths. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. Final tests, she announced, standing up with the deliberate movements of someone preparing to deliver a death blow. I'm taking you to separate rooms. You're going to write down the exact details of this thunderstorm night, the time, what movie you were watching, what happened next, every specific detail you can remember. If this marriage is legitimate, if you really love each other the way you claim, your accounts will be identical down to the smallest detail. As she prepared to separate us, Jake's hand found mine under the table, his fingers intertwining with mine in a grip that was probably too tight but felt like an anchor in a storm. In that touch, I felt something that went far beyond our practiced performance, something that made my heart race with possibilities I'd never dared to consider. Don't worry, I whispered as they prepared to lead him away, squeezing his hand one last time. Just tell the truth. His eyes searched mine, confusion and something else, hope, flickering in their green depths. The truth about that night, I clarified, though part of me wanted to say so much more. Just remember that night exactly as it happened. As they led him from the room, I felt the weight of our entire future settling on my shoulders. In a few minutes, I would have to write down the details of a night that had changed everything for me. A night when I'd realized that my feelings for Jake Morrison had moved far beyond friendship into territory that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. The problem was, I'd never told Jake how that night had affected me. I'd kept those realizations locked away, convinced that admitting them would destroy our friendship. Now our freedom depended on whether Jake had felt even a fraction of what I'd experienced that perfect storm-filled April evening. Officer Martinez returned with a stack of blank paper and a pen, setting them in front of me with the solemnity of a judge delivering a sentence. Write everything, she instructed. Every detail, every word exchanged. Every moment from the beginning of that storm until the power came back on. If you're lying, we'll know. And if you're lying, Mr. Carter, you'll both be in federal custody by tomorrow morning. As I picked up the pen with shaking hands, I realized that the next hour would determine not just whether Jake could stay in the country, but whether our fake marriage might somehow miraculously become the beginning of something real. Alone in the sterile detention room, staring at the blank paper in front of me, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the pen. This wasn't just about our fake marriage anymore. This was about everything. Jake's future, our friendship, and maybe, just maybe, something I'd never dared to hope for but had dreamed about every night for the past 3 years. April 15th, I began writing, my handwriting more careful and deliberate than it had ever been. We were watching The Notebook. Carter had chosen the movie and I'd protested, but secretly enjoyed it. The storm started around 9. I paused, closing my eyes and letting myself remember that night with perfect, painful clarity. It hadn't been just any night. It had been the night that changed everything for me, even if I'd never had the courage to admit it out loud. The night I'd realized that what I felt for Jake Morrison went far beyond friendship into territory that both thrilled and terrified me. The power went out during the rain scene in the movie. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Jake got up to find candles in my kitchen. They were vanilla-scented because I always buy vanilla candles. They remind me of home. When he came back to the couch, he sat closer than usual, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with the vanilla. My hand was steadier now as the memories flooded back. I could see Jake's face in that golden candlelight, could remember exactly how the shadows played across his features, making him look like something out of a classical painting. I'd been hyper-aware of every inch of space between us, of the way his shoulder brushed against mine when he leaned forward to adjust the candles. In the candlelight, Jake looked different, softer somehow, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. We started talking about everything and nothing. Our fears about the future, our dreams, what we really wanted from life. The conversation had a weight to it that our usual banter didn't have. I remembered that conversation word for word. Jake had talked about his fears of not being good enough, of his parents' expectations weighing him down. I'd shared things I'd never told anyone else, my insecurities about my writing, my terror that I'd never accomplish anything meaningful. In the flickering light, with the storm raging outside, it had felt like we were the only two people in the world. Around 11 p.m., Jake said something that stopped my breath. "Carter, have you ever wondered what would happen if we—" Then he stopped, shook his head, looked away. When I pressed him to finish the thought, he gave me that nervous smile he gets when he's trying to deflect and said, "Nothing important." But something had changed in that moment. The way he was looking at me, the way I was suddenly aware of how close we were sitting. This was the part that had haunted me for months. What had Jake been about to say? Had he been feeling the same electric tension I was feeling? Had he been about to cross the line from friendship into something more, only to lose his nerve at the last second? The power came back on around midnight, flooding the apartment with harsh electric light that destroyed the intimate bubble we'd created. Jake immediately moved back to his usual spot on the other end of the couch, and we finished watching the movie in relative silence. But something fundamental had shifted between us that night. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. The way I found myself studying his face, memorizing every detail. I set down the pen and rubbed my temples, overwhelmed by the intensity of the memories. That night had been a turning point, but I'd convinced myself I was reading too much into it. Jake had gone back to his normal behavior the next day, and I'd buried my feelings deeper than ever, convinced that admitting them would ruin the best friendship I'd ever had. After that night, everything was different between us, even if we both pretended otherwise. There were moments when I'd catch him staring, moments when a casual touch would linger just a little too long. Conversations that felt loaded with unspoken possibilities. I spent months wondering if I was imagining it all, if my feelings were making me see things that weren't really there. The door opened and Officer Martinez entered with Jake, whose face was pale but determined. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, a nervous habit I knew all too well. When our eyes met across the room, I saw something there that made my heart skip, a mixture of anxiety, hope, and something that looked remarkably like love. "Exchange papers," Officer Martinez said simply, her tone giving nothing away about what she might be thinking. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he reached for my paper, and I could see the slight hesitation in his movements. Whatever he'd written, he was nervous about my reaction to it. I took his paper with careful hands as if it might explode if I held it too tightly. My breath caught as I read his account of that April night. Every detail matched mine perfectly. The time, the movie, even the vanilla candles. But it was the last line that stopped my heart completely. I wanted to tell Carter that I was in love with him, but I didn't have the courage. I never imagined he might feel the same way. I looked up to find Jake watching me intently, his green eyes wide with vulnerability and something that looked like terror. He'd written the truth. After all this time, after all the pretending and careful distance, he'd finally written down what I'd been hoping to hear for 3 years. Officer Martinez was reading both our papers with the thoroughness of someone whose job it was to catch people in lies. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she looked up at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well," she said, setting our papers aside with deliberate care, "that's certainly comprehensive." Officer Martinez studied both our papers for what felt like an eternity, her sharp eyes moving back and forth between the documents, as if she was trying to decode some hidden message. Jake and I sat in absolute silence, neither of us daring to breathe too loudly, let alone speak. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it might suffocate us both. Finally, after the longest pause of my life, she looked up at us and spoke. "Congratulations, your marriage has been approved for immigration purposes." Relief flooded through me like a tidal wave. But I couldn't bring myself to look at Jake. His confession was burned into my memory. Those words written in his careful handwriting that admitted he'd been in love with me for 3 years. Our fake marriage had been approved, but now I had no idea what was real and what had been acting. The walk out of the federal building felt surreal, like moving through a dream where nothing quite made sense. We were legally married, Jake's visa was secure, and we'd successfully fooled the US government into believing our love was real. The problem was, I was no longer sure it had been entirely fake on either side. "Carter," Jake's voice broke the awkward silence as we walked down the busy Manhattan sidewalk. Office workers rushed past us, everyone absorbed in their own lives and dramas, completely unaware that my entire world had just been turned upside down. "What I wrote on that paper, you meant it?" I interrupted, finally finding the courage to stop walking and face him directly. "About that night, about your feelings, was any of it real?" Jake stopped too, turning to face me with an expression that was equal parts vulnerable and terrified. For a moment he just stood there, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The afternoon sun caught the gold highlights in his hair, and I was struck by how unfairly beautiful he was, even when he looked like he might bolt at any second. "I've been in love with you for 3 years, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the city noise around us. "The fake marriage proposal. I was desperate about the deportation, yes. But Carter," his voice cracked slightly, "I was more terrified of losing you than losing my visa. At least if we were married, even fake married, I'd get to keep you in my life somehow." My heart was racing so fast I was genuinely concerned. I might pass out right there on the sidewalk. "Jake, I've been in love with you too. Since the day we met in Professor Williams' literature class." I said yes to the fake marriage because I took a shaky breath, hardly believing I was finally saying these words out loud, because I wanted to be as close to a real relationship with you as possible, even if it was all pretend. Jake's face transformed, lighting up with a smile so bright it could have powered half of Manhattan. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the little flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice soft and wondering. "We're already legally married. What if we made it real?" I whispered, hardly daring to voice the thought that had been growing in my mind since I'd read his confession. "I mean really real this time? You mean like, actually be married? Not just for immigration purposes?" Jake's smile grew even wider. "If that was possible. Like wake up next to each other every morning because we want to, not because we have to keep up appearances." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Well, we're already legally bound to each other," I pointed out. We've got the certificate, we've convinced the government, we've even got matching rings. All that's missing, the real feelings part, Jake finished, then shook his head with a grin. Except we've had that all along, haven't we? We were just too scared to admit it. Never fake again, I said, reaching up to cup his face in my hands. His skin was warm and slightly rough, where he'd started growing out his beard, and touching him like this, without pretending it was for show, felt like coming home. Never fake again, he promised, and then he kissed me. This kiss was nothing like our fake wedding kiss in City Hall. This was real, full of 3 years of suppressed longing and love finally set free. Jake's arms came around me, pulling me closer as his lips moved against mine with a desperation that matched my own. I could taste the mint gum he'd been chewing, could feel the slight tremor in his hands as they tangled in my hair. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against mine. "So," he said with that crooked smile that had made me fall in love with him in the first place, "I guess this means we need to plan a real honeymoon." I burst out laughing, feeling giddy with happiness and relief and the overwhelming joy of finally having everything I'd ever wanted. "I love you," I said, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on my tongue. "I love you too," Jake replied, and this time when he said it, I knew beyond any doubt that he meant it. God, it feels good to finally say that out loud. Standing there on that busy Manhattan street, legally married to my best friend and the love of my life, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful things start as lies until you discover they were truth all along. Our fake marriage had become the foundation for something real, something precious, something worth all the fear and uncertainty we'd endured to get here. Jake was safe from deportation. Our love was finally out in the open, and we were together, not for the government, not for appearances, but because we were meant to be. Sometimes the best love stories begin with pretending, right up until the moment you realize you weren't pretending at all.